Hello YouTube! You might have noticed that it has become trendy for influencers nowadays to tell their audience that if they want big shoulders, the only thing they need to do is to just spam lateral raises. An advice that is extremely fashionable because it's super straightforward. The issue is that I personally believe that this is horrible advice and that oftentimes the opposite is going to happen. By following this training trap, you are going to sabotage your growth because you're going to start learning the wrong lessons. So today, I want to explain to you why spamming lateral raises won't work and why the idea of spamming a lift to correct a weak point is oftentimes counterproductive. So let's start with the notion of a spammable lift. What exactly makes a lift spammable? Well, in my opinion, it means that you are able to do the lift 2 to 4 times a week, so with super high frequency to get a ton of volume and therefore a ton of growth. And naturally, based on these criteria, this means that compound movements are out of the picture. Because if you train them intensely and close to failure, you will never be able to hit that frequency. If I tell you, hey, just spam deadlifts, bro, yeah, that's not gonna work. So we are left with one candidate, and that is isolation movements. Isolation movements tend to generate less fatigue, they tend to be easier on the tendons, no actual loading, they don't fatigue the spine or the lower back. So overall, this is the type of movement that is going to be selected to target and to correct, quote unquote, a weak point. And so if someone comes to you and asks, hey, how do I get bigger shoulders? The answer will be, just spam lateral raises. And obviously that's a super attractive idea to promote. Just do that one movement every single time you step into the gym and you'll get huge. No need to actually pay attention to what you're doing, spam and you'll turn into Ronnie Coleman. The problem is that this simplistic approach to training completely ignores the number one factor that would actually lead to growth, namely progression. Because what makes your shoulders grow when you do these lateral raises isn't the fact that you're doing the movement, but that your numbers go up. So it's the progression on the movement that matters and not the movements in itself. And I know that this might sound like it's me just splitting hairs, but it's super important that you make this distinction in your head. Because if you don't, you're going to start believing that more frequency is always better, when in reality, more frequency is only better if it leads to progression. So you could be the guy that does lateral raises 4 times a week for a year, but if your strength numbers don't go up, and if you don't actually progress via metrics on the movement, your shoulders are going to remain the exact same. And the issue is that for anyone who has attempted to progress on isolation movements, you know that they're super hard to progress on, because the amount of muscle you recruit overall on these specific patterns is very, very small, which is not a bad thing because it allows you to pinpoint these parts of your body, but you know for a fact that you're never going to put 50 pounds on an isolation lift in a year. It simply won't happen, which also means that retroactively, these movements tend to plateau extremely quickly. You tend to have to retake the same weights times and times again, get those extra reps until you can finally graduate to a new weight and then progress forward. And you also know, if you have tried, that simply upping the frequency of that specific isolation movement in order to force progression is very unlikely to work. If anything, it's going to be counterproductive because now you're going to start cutting down on recovery time that is actually what allows growth to occur, which in return produces progression. So you're going to end up being the type of person that has a lagging muscle group. You'll then try to hit that muscle group as often as you can. And because of that, paradoxically, that muscle group will remain lagging because you never give it the space and the time it needs to grow. And this is something that escapes many people's heads. Because when we think lagging muscle group, oftentimes we think small and weak, but we never think not endurant enough. A characteristic of a muscle group that is behind is the fact that it has no work capacity. So it tends to tire extremely quickly. When you attempt to build up that muscle group, what needs to be built up first is that work capacity. But if you don't allow the muscle to actually recover in between sessions, the only thing you do is you keep it in a state of constant fatigue where progress has no space to occur. Frequency is not something you can decide on arbitrarily. You can't just say, okay, I want to hit that muscle 4 times a week. It's the muscle that dictates how many times you can hit it. And that is super important because oftentimes you'll find that you'll have to earn your frequency. To be able to hit a muscle group more than 2 or 3 times a week takes a lot of work on your part. But the spam the lateral raise beam completely ignores that. It tells you, hey, hit it every time you get into the gym, which is the wrong way to think about training because now you start to obsess over a weak point. Your progression slows down because of your own doing, your own attempt at doing too much, and you start to create unneeded frustrations for yourself, which in return kill any joy or fun you have when it comes to actually train that muscle group, which will pretty much sign the fact that this muscle group will remain a weak point forever. Now, that doesn't mean that isolation movements don't work to correct weak points. It's simply that if you really want to be able to spam a lift, you're going to have to get to that space first. You can't start there. So what you need to do is you need to hit the target muscle whenever it is recovered and whenever it is able to perform properly. That is how you put progression and recovery first. And over time, you get to a point where you can do more and more and more with more and more and more weight, which always leads to muscle gains. But even with that perspective shift, it doesn't change the fact that progression on isolation is going to remain slow, whether you do it 2 times or 4 times a week. So to make up for it, we have to start applying a different type of pattern that is going to correct the flaws that isolations tend to have. And what are these things? They're compound movements. The very same compound movements that your attempt at spamming a lift rejected because they did not have the proper characteristics to allow that. But paradoxically, these also are the very same movements that would make the biggest difference in your physique. For the simple reason that they, contrary to isolation lifts, help to recruit more overall muscle groups at the same time and also therefore allow for steadier progression. If you compare your ability to put on weight on isolation or compounds, you know that one, you get much stronger on compounds, of course, but also that it's easier to add weight every single session or every other session, as opposed to a bicep curl that might stay at the same weight for maybe 3 weeks, maybe a month. So now, instead of being stuck constantly in isolation plateaus, you have your compound movement on the side that is going to constantly progress. But that is only possible if you give enough space for the compounds to exist. And that's another paradox of this spam lateral raises meme. Oftentimes, you'll find that to be able to do that, to follow that method, you're going to have to slash every other muscle that targets the shoulder, because if not, it's going to be absolutely impossible to hit your 3 times to 4 times a week frequency. And so you have a tendency to push away these horizontal presses that would fatigue the shoulder, thinking, oh, the isolation will take care of that. Well, no, it won't. The only thing you're doing is you're removing the part of the program that would, one, allow the lateral raises to keep progressing, 2, allow the lateral raise frequency to make sense, and 3, that would have given you the biggest shoulder gains in your program. And this mistake is often brought forth by a misunderstanding of fatigue. Because if you compare an isolation and a compound, yes, the compound gives you more overall fatigue. But this is actually a good thing. It saves you time. You hit a ton of muscle groups at once. And you'll find that this won't actually impair your ability to hit isolation. If you do it properly, usually what will happen is that you'll have a 2-to-1 ratio. So you'll do twice as many isolation lifts for one muscle group as opposed to compounds, which will be made up by the fact that you lift more weights on compounds. But that ratio I just described is always better than a 3-to-0 ratio where you only do isolation. And the opposite is also true, by the way. If you're the type who does only compounds, you're also missing out, because every single flow of isolation lifts is made up by the great points of compounds and vice versa. So it's entirely stupid to ignore one or the other, especially for a method that is supposedly going to make you blow up. And as I said previously, you'll also find that by doing that, your progression on lateral raises is going to be much steadier and even faster, because the muscle mass you'll build on presses will also be utilized when you elevate the arm. So now the two lifts are going to feed one another instead of competing with one another, which is what I call a virtuous circle. Meanwhile, someone who just spams lateral raises enters the exact opposite, which is a vicious circle. Because since you do the same lift times and times again for the same muscle group, eventually you hit diminishing returns. Your progression stops entirely and you're essentially working for nothing. Which should not be surprising, you only have one movement pattern you can progress on. So when it stops, the entirety of the progress for the muscle group stops, and you understand that since progression is going to grind to a halt, any amount of muscle growth you could have expected from that method is going to stop as well. So once we accept that, we see that the training logic behind progression is actually very simple. You're going to use these two lifts, so your press and your isolation for the shoulder, for as long as you can progress. And when you can no longer progress with that amount of volume or frequency, you're going to up it. And you can up it with variations or rotations, which will all serve the same purpose, which is to feed more work to the muscle. If you're looking for a more in-depth explanation, I actually have made one. It's in the description. It's called the unlimited hypertrophy method. And if you don't really want to worry so much about all of this theory and you just want someone to tell you, hey, just do this, you're also in luck. I made a shoulders master plan that tells you exactly which lift to pick, when to progress in volume, etc., etc. Once again, in the description. So now that I told you exactly why the spamming the lateral raise meme doesn't actually work, you could counter that by saying that you've seen videos where it does. You've seen crazy transformation where the guy grew massive shoulders off of spamming lateral raises. So you might be inclined to reject my arguments and say, well, in reality, there are examples where it does work. You might even have heard some PD users tell you that super high frequency training is the way to go. If you want to have a muscle blow up, you just have to train it more frequently. Let me explain to you why these examples actually don't mean anything. The first reason is because the person in the video is always a novice. So what you see is someone who's never trained a muscle group before, who then starts to isolate it and gains lean mass. That should not be surprising. Regardless of the method, when you are untrained, everything works. Meaning that what you're witnessing is newbie gains. That is perfectly normal, even if the method is not actually sound. The question is this guy going to be able to keep up progressing with the same method when he becomes intermediate or even advanced? The answer is no. Why? Because frequency as a practice is limited, because there's only so many days in the week. So if you got big via spamming lateral raises 4 times a week, what is the next step? 5 times? 6 times? This is not sustainable in the long term. And the people who made these videos are going to realize it once they start to actually hit some territories of muscle growth that require to actually pay attention. Which leads to my second argument. Usually the guys in these videos are not big. This is why these videos tend to be super popular amongst teenagers. It's because you're seeing someone who's a few steps ahead of you. But understand that this guy didn't do anything impressive or crazy, and there's absolutely nothing magical with the method. You believe there is because you're looking for a simple blueprint to mass, and so you might actually get some gains from that, but your ability to keep progressing past that early stage where, again, anything would have worked is going to be drastically limited because you're taught the wrong lesson by someone who should not have been teaching anything to start with. And as for the PD users who swear that they corrected their weak points by just hammering isolation as often as possible, you have to keep in mind that the same logic also applies. These are people who would grow from pretty much anything. And on top of that, you have to understand that something that PDs do in general is that they heighten your recovery. So the aspect I spoke about earlier, which would prevent you from spamming, doesn't exist for them. They can feed as much fatigue as they want to the muscle, especially via isolation, and it will blow up because they will never be limited by that time span where they need to rest. You, on the other hand, will not be able to do that. So, as a rule of thumb, it's always a good idea as a natural lifter to ignore the advice of PD users because for the majority, they have forgotten what it means to be human. So in conclusion, yes, targeting a muscle via isolation is going to make it grow. No one ever denied it. But spamming these isolation lifts, thinking it's going to be the secret to becoming a mass monster, is actually going to be the reason why you're most likely going to plateau very early, get frustrated, and quit. So it's entirely counterproductive. Now, we've turned a good thing into a bad thing. The good thing being that the fix is actually quite simple, as I outlined in this video. So this is going to be it for today. I hope this was informative. If you learned something from me and you would like to support the channel, you can do so. It's the first link in the description, my Ko-fi page. You can pledge or you can donate. Anything allows me to keep making these videos for you guys. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.